Well, what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight was trying to apply this practice of Buddhist compassion that we practiced earlier. How do we actually apply this practice for ourselves or for others in the real world? And in particular, I've been thinking about how it gets applied in sometimes in like higher stakes situations of conflict. I've been teaching a little bit about Buddhism and conflict with Renee Rivera, who Rachel was mentioning earlier. He and I have been teaching a class online a couple months ago called Finding Liberation in Relationship. And conflict is a piece of what we're talking about there in that class. Some of you have been in that class, so it's great to see you here in this space. So talking about some new stuff here as I keep thinking a lot about conflict and how to, just kind of how to be a Buddhist and be in conflict. So one is just even like, what are we talking about when we talk about conflict? So for me, that could be anything, like maybe you're in a disagreement with a friend about how they treated you last week, and you're trying to have a conversation about it. I feel like anytime I'm part of a political group, I'm always in some kind of conflict because we can't agree on next strategic steps. So that's a conflict. Maybe you feel some persistent disconnection from your family of origin. That's just kind of a lingering conflict. Maybe you and your housemates can't agree on chore distribution, and that's a conflict that needs to get sorted out. But wanting to really think about conflict as distinguished from abuse. Like if you hear conflict and you actually think about a situation where you or someone is actually at more immediate risk of violence or harm, that's more of an abuse situation. And so that's a situation where you'd want to be thinking about how to establish safety for yourself or anybody else that's at risk. And so it's helpful for my brain to kind of put that in a category that's separate from being frustrated with housemates about how to manage chores, because I might deal with those situations differently. So we're more on the conflict side of things than the abuse side of things tonight. And I'll say, as someone who grew up among white people in the Midwest, we did a lot of conflict and anger avoidance. That's what we do well. Even though my parents were actually in a lot of deep conflict in their marriage for 40 years. My dad was cheating on my mom for basically all of that time. And we didn't really learn about it until their marriage broke up 40 years into it. But at the same time, our bodies know things, even if we don't know the story. And so once the story came out, my body was like, oh, that's why I have understood my family to be dysfunctional around certain things for my entire life. And I really had learned to be a certain kind of emotional mediator in my family and in other places for my own survival. I also feel like I'm a person who I feel very conditioned sometimes that anytime there's visible conflict, I feel like a relationship is going to break apart. I see people nodding. And I also somehow, because I was a child around kind of secretive conflict, I often assume I'm probably at fault for any conflict that's arising. So I've had to learn that that's actually some distorted thinking about that any conflict is a problem. And maybe other people have similar distorted views as me, or you have your own views on conflict that are shaped by your early experiences. So it's helpful just when we start talking about conflict to realize like, we can have some very tight views on it. And I know at least for me, a lot of my views on conflict feel very distorted. I'm reading a book, which is right here, which folks might have heard of, called Conflict is Not Abuse by Sarah Schulman. And she's a queer Jewish author. And part of why I brought it here is because there was a particular line in this chapter where she started talking about how Buddhists deal with conflict. And so I kind of wanted to bring it to you all and be like, is this how we deal with conflict as people who are trained in meditation and Buddhism? Or are there other ways that we are learning to deal with conflict given these practices? So just a little bit on the context of this chapter. So she's writing a chapter where she's unpacking the escalation of conflict. And she's in this entire book really questioning how people can escalate conflict as abuse, as a way to kind of minimize our own contributions to harm. So for me, that can look like kind of jumping to attack what the other person is messing up before checking in on anything I might be contributing to a dynamic. So with the example of like chore distribution being kind of messed up in the household, an example of that might be that I'm like kind of obsessed with how everyone else is forgetting to do their chores. And I'm like, you're not doing this and you're not doing that. But I'm not actually noticing that the way that I'm surveilling the entire house on chores actually has an impact, that actually matters. And like can actually influence how people are going to relate to me and relate to how they're going to show up and do their chores. So even as I'm obsessing about everyone else, I need to also pay attention to what I'm contributing to the dynamic. So she's laying this out in the chapter. And she then has these couple of lines where she gets a little flippant about people who are avoiding conflict. And she says, certainly I'm not a practitioner of just like doing nothing around conflict. There's little that is more destructive than the passive bystander allowing cruelty to be freely imposed. And this is the thing I really wanted to think about with you all. She says, I'm the opposite of a Buddhist, as I believe in action. And so I don't know for sure exactly why she has this reaction to Buddhists. Like maybe she has a Buddhist friend who's like really intensely a pacifist and is calling that politic a Buddhist politic. But she does have me questioning, is there something in our training as Buddhists, as meditators? Do you feel like we are passive bystanders in the face of conflict? Is that the training that we get? And do we, the Alphabet Sangha, as queer and trans Buddhists and meditators, do we have something specific to say about this as folks who maybe believe in action in some way? Because as I thought about it, especially from our perspective, like conflict feels very much in our history as queer and trans folks, right? I mean, we could start with the bricks at Stonewall. We could talk about fighting for legal rights. We could talk about coming out of the closet to families and worlds that just resist our right to just be who we are. And so it's hard to feel like queer and trans folks are not just going to embrace conflict as part of who we are and part of how we're going to just need to show up in the world to be engaged and alive. But I do have a question, like, do the teachings of Buddhism try to teach us something different than this? And is there conflict? Do we feel conflict in those teachings? And because sometimes, we've learned a little bit on compassion in the meditation practice. It can sometimes seem to coach us towards a sense of kindness that might avoid directness, might avoid anger. So I'm curious if it's possible to be with our pain and like still be throwing bricks. Like, is this part of who we are in our practice? So for context, for those of you who are getting to know me, I've certainly been in these questions for a while. I worked for 8 years as co-director of the Buddhist Peace Fellowship, which does work cultivating liberation at the intersections of Buddhism and social justice. And certainly there were Buddhists who brought a very pacifist outlook to that organization. Most of us were very much on the front lines of social action. And for that last decade, that looked like shutting down police stations and conference hotels and highways to interrupt police violence. That looked like sending folks to dangle from a bridge to disrupt an Arctic drill that was trying to get out on a boat to fast forward climate change. That has looked like, looked like continued direct action, demanding that PG&E maintains some power to live for disabled and fat people, rather than shutting their power off to avoid deadly fires. So action is certainly part of what I'm up to. And, that work doesn't just come from our own interests, but it does come from a Buddhist sense, much come from the wisdom of Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh and other Vietnamese Buddhist monks who were leaving monasteries during the Vietnam War, and Buddhism became a political stance, an opportunity to really build political power with Buddhist practice. One of my favorite stories is a Thai Buddhist monk who in the 1990s was ordaining trees, like actually dressing them up in orange monastic robes, and so that he could invite people to see the trees as sacred, and in an attempt to try to protect them from being cut down to protect the environment. And one reason I really love this political move of ordaining the trees is because it weaves together what I think of as these three core strategies that at Buddhist Peace Fellowship we called block, build, and be. Blocking harm, destructive harm, violence, building new solutions, new dreams, and actually like being new versions of ourselves that we actually need to be in order to be in the new liberated world that we want to be in. And so for me, this ordination of trees both like blocks the harm of cutting them down, builds a new community, and even just an idea of community that who's actually even human and beyond human that we want to include in that community. and really invites just like a new, like people into a new sense of what is sacred. It just completely transforms that idea. So that's part of what I've been thinking about. And I'll also say that this, to me, when I'm invited into conflict, I have learned to really think about it as an invitation to compassion rather than an invitation away from compassion. And part of that, I've really appreciated this teaching from Sobonfu Some, who writes about this in her book, The Spirit of Intimacy, Ancient African Teachings and the Ways of Relationship. And she writes that conflict is the spirit of the relationship asking itself to deepen. And it really helps me think about how relationship rupture and repair is a necessary part of intimacy building, and that conflict is what pushes us into a kind of emotional risk-taking with each other. And for me, compassion for myself and others is part of what supports me to do that kind of emotionally risky work. I'll also just share this teaching from Buddhist teacher Lama Rod Owens, who he's thinking about how when we are looking at compassionate conflict outside of ourselves, that same conflict is mirrored inside us, that there's, I don't know, it is very interconnected there. And so he's saying, we see war in the world where there is war inside of me, there is tension inside of me, there is desire to harm inside of me. So as you are working to disrupt war in the world, we also have to disrupt war in our interpersonal experience, in our internal experience. If the internal experience isn't worked on, then you just recreate the systems in the external world. If I really want to disrupt the violence that I see in the world, then I need to get serious about disrupting violence in my own system by cultivating compassion and wisdom, care and clarity. And he says this is the heart of the Bodhisattva tradition, which is a tradition in his Tibetan lineage that is really seeking the liberation of all beings. So part of what I hear in his thinking is that both internal and external compassion practice is really here to amplify our capacity to engage with conflict rather than to encourage us to avoid it. But this is what I'm thinking about in terms of conflict and compassion. But I was really excited to be able to chat with you all after I read Sarah Schulman saying Buddhists do not believe in action and essentially avoid conflict. Because I felt curious, like, what is your sense? Do you feel like Buddhists are passive bystanders in the face of conflict? Is that what we get trained to do in our meditation practice, in the teachings of Buddhism? And as queer and trans Buddhists, do we have something to say about that? Or is there something else that compassion practice teaches you about how to relate to conflict? But just to close up our time for this evening, just really like taking this time to reflect on our intention to practice tonight. That is, just we have brought our attention, that is part of the practice, just bringing our attention here to mindfulness this evening. letting whatever teachings, practice has benefited you, letting that just land and feeling its support for you. And letting that support ripple out to others as whatever we are learning here, as it changes us, it also changes how we show up in the world and has impacts that we do not even know how to understand yet. Just imagining that these impacts ripple out and impact people we know, people we don't know, in ways that are most needed. Letting our practice and intention to practice be here for the benefit of all beings.